Alice had a draining day at work, ending with a tense argument with her boss. She felt her nerves fraying as she drove home. All she wanted was to enjoy a simple meal, drink a cup of coffee, and let the soft breeze on her balcony ease her troubled mind. Before heading home, she stopped by her friend Nitra's house to drop off a cake she'd picked up earlier. As she pulled into her apartment complex, something seemed off. A man sat slumped in front of her door. His clothes were filthy, his beard long and unkempt, and his entire demeanor reeked of neglect. Alice hesitated. She didn't recognize him and didn't want to engage. Avoiding eye contact, she tried to slip past him and into her apartment. But just as she reached for the doorknob, the man spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Alice," he said, sending a chill down her spine. "You were right today, but your boss doesn't agree." She froze. How did this man know her name? And how could he know about the argument at work? Without looking back, she opened the door, rushed inside, and locked it. Her hands trembled as she leaned against the door. As Alice prepared her dinner, the man's words replayed in her mind. They felt impossibly specific, and she couldn't shake the unease they caused. Unable to resist her curiosity, she peered through the peephole. The man hadn't moved. His body was still, almost unnaturally so. Then, as though he sensed her watching, he tilted his head slightly and muttered, "You're wondering who I am, aren't you?" Alice's breath caught. She hesitated before responding. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" The man didn't reply. His silence was unnerving, and his stillness felt almost inhuman. Frustrated and frightened, Alice stepped away from the door, determined to ignore him. Later, she tried to relax on her balcony, letting the cool breeze wash over her. The night sky was serene, but her mind was anything but. The man's presence lingered in her thoughts like a shadow. Who was he? And how did he know about her boss? Eventually, Alice retreated to bed. Just as she was drifting off, a faint scratching sound startled her awake. Her eyes flew open, and she listened intently. The sound grew louder. It was coming from her front door. Someone was trying to force it open. Heart pounding, Alice crept toward the door, her footsteps silent on the floor. She could see the knob turning, hear the faint creak of the lock under pressure. Then, with a sudden crash, the door burst open and the man lunged inside. He fell onto her, pinning her to the ground. His hand clamped over her mouth, and his voice was a harsh whisper. "Scream, and I'll tear you apart." Terror froze her in place. Alice nodded, her eyes wide with fear. The man dragged her to a chair and tied her wrists and ankles with a cord he seemed to produce out of nowhere. After securing her, he wandered into her kitchen, rummaging through her belongings. He ate her dinner, drank her coffee, and returned to sit across from her, his gaze piercing and unrelenting. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his tone mocking. Alice stared at him, searching his face. Something about him was familiar yet elusive. Then realization struck like lightning. "Martin?" she whispered. The man grinned. "So, you do remember me." Alice's mind raced. Martin had been a coworker 2 years ago. He'd been quiet, unassuming, and completely unremarkable. But one day he'd been fired abruptly, and she'd never seen him again. "What do you want?" she demanded. "Why are you here?" Martin leaned closer, his voice dripping with resentment. 2 years ago, you made a mistake. You left a file on the desk, incomplete and riddled with errors. The boss blamed me. I was fired. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" Alice frowned. She vaguely remembered the incident but didn't recall it being serious. "That wasn't my fault," she argued. "You were responsible for your own work." Martin's laughter was cold and joyless. "Do you think it matters? I lost everything, my job, my wife, my kids, all because of you." Alice shook her head, refusing to take the blame. "That's not fair," she shouted. Martin ignored her protests. Instead, he pulled a pen from his pocket and wrote something on her floor. The numbers glared back at her. 12.12, 2024. "What does this mean?" she demanded. "It's the day you'll lose everything," Martin said, his voice eerily calm. Before Alice could respond, the lights flickered, and when they steadied, Martin was gone. In the days that followed, strange things began happening. At work, her boss seemed colder than usual, avoiding eye contact. Colleagues whispered behind her back, and files disappeared from her desk only to reappear altered. Alice tried to convince herself it was paranoia, but one night she received an email from an anonymous address. The subject line was blank, and the message contained only a video attachment. With trembling hands, Alice clicked on the file. The footage showed her apartment door. Martin stood outside, staring directly into the camera. His expression was unreadable, his eyes piercing. The video ended abruptly. Alice felt a chill crawl down her spine. She checked her locks twice that night but couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. As December approached, Alice became increasingly paranoid. The date 12/12/2024 loomed in her mind like a dark cloud. Then, on the night before, her phone rang. The voice on the other end was distorted, but the words were unmistakable. "Are you ready to lose it all?" Alice couldn't sleep that night. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and every creak of the apartment made her jump. When the clock struck 12 high, she held her breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. Exhausted and confused, Alice collapsed onto her bed. Maybe it had all been an elaborate prank. But just as she closed her eyes, she heard the faint sound of laughter echoing through her apartment. Alice bolted upright, her heart pounding. The laughter grew louder, and a single thought filled her mind. This was only the beginning.